Did he go now? Okay, nice.
Yep, set on my
Yeah,
side.
yeah. So again, thanks, Leon, for joining. Absolute pleasure to have you to talk about these things. Let's get right into it. The very first thing that I want to ask you is that what do you consider a loot box then? Talking about this. So,
Yeah, well, I think any sort of in-game purchases that involves some sort of randomization would count under the definition. Now, of course, we have the really obvious examples. So you're spending money to buy a box, virtual box inside the game, you get random rewards. Nobody would disagree with you. That's a loot box. That's the classic example. But then we had instead of buying the boxes directly, we had the player spending real world money to buy a virtual premium currency and then using that currency to buy a box to get random rewards. That's still a loot box. I don't think people would disagree. But increasingly, we're seeing more complicated implementations. So quite recently, we've seen, for example, as part of a battle pass. So those are the systems where you pay money to gain access to the ability to get more rewards as you play more of the game. So if you just spend money, you're not guaranteed to get everything. You have to also play the game to guarantee getting the things. So a question comes then, what if there is a loot box that is on the paid part of the battle pass? Does that count as a loot box that perhaps should be regulated? We just had an answer from the Australian government saying that yes, yes, of course. You paid money. It took you some time before you got to the random rewards, but it was still money that got turned into random rewards, and also that involved some sort of gameplay to make you eligible for it. Didn't really matter. If there was some money at the start and random rewards at the end, that would be a loot box. But then, of course, and sorry if this is a bit of a long answer, but there are just so many examples, especially because I think games are now making these more convoluted ways of implementing them, perhaps to make the transaction less clear to the player. So quite popular in some games, you can spend energy to generate a random reward. Usually, you can receive the energy by waiting. So, say every 5 minutes, you get one energy, and every one energy you can use to get a random reward. But then the game allows you to spend money to buy the energies. Does that count as a loot box? I would say yes, but I believe others might disagree. So yeah, lots of examples, and of course, if we reduce my definition to the extreme, it's quite ridiculous. But what I said at the start was if this was some sort of in-game purchases that involves random elements, then it's a loot box. I have been presented with the example of a DLC for a video game,
mhm,
so that's an expansion pack for a video game,
yeah.
and in that expansion pack, you gain access to this new enemy that has a random loot. Now, you defeating that enemy each time
Mm,
doesn't cost you any money, but you bought that expansion pack to start with. Is that a
mm,
loot box or not? Uh,
mm,
I don't think that's the thing that we want to regulate here, but it is very difficult to define. I think some examples are more obvious than others, and we should probably just act against the ones that are obviously problematic. And when we get those borderline
mm,
examples, we just have to think about them more when we do get them.
yeah. Thanks for that. This is exactly the reason that I asked this question because it does seem to me as a researcher of these subjects as well that there can be quite varied definitions and descriptions of what constitutes a loot box. And but yes, so thinking about this, like you mentioned, the kind of slaying enemies and getting a reward from that, this is one of the origins of that kind of term in a
Yeah.
sense, loot box. That was what was called, for example, in World of Warcraft. People did call that sort of the box that when you kill an enemy, boss, whatever you open at that's actually a literal loot box. But in a sense nowadays, thinking about it, that sort of I do agree there that think about would you say then that having a kind of purchase, a random reward, sort of purchase, uncertainty, and then kind of that sort of either you get something, you always get something, don't you? That's the kind of also thinking about gambling, thinking about loot boxes, the separation. Would you say then that like on the base level, these are kind of the same. You pay something, you pay upfront something that is purchasable, whatever it might be, gems, direct money,
Yeah.
whatever. Then there's a random outcome, and then the sort of reward. But these are also
Yeah,
classifications
I
of
think those are
gambling.
elements that certainly you would want. But I guess one thing that I've said that I think differentiates the loot box that we think about in say what was originally implemented in Overwatch, the classic type of loot boxes, is that you can make repeat purchases. You can
Mm,
keep buying more and more of those loot boxes, and that means spending more money for more chances. Whilst with the expansion pack example I gave you that's a one-time thing. Like you spend money once, and then you can keep defeating that enemy on your own without any additional costs. So I guess we're not concerned with the latter because it doesn't involve basically an infinite amount of money potentially.
mm,
But then, I thought more about this because people have asked me this question before, and I've said, well, if we decide that the second type shouldn't be regulated, then I can see a company deciding to sell that expansion pack for a lot of money instead. So, similar idea, but instead of selling the expansion pack, say for 10 euros, they're gonna sell it
mm.
for 200 euros. Um, but then more money is then involved. So I don't know. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
It, yeah. I can, yes, exactly. That is the sort of tricky aspect of this as well, that when we can think about kind of either sort of removing these possibilities from especially like minors, thinking about underage kids that are playing these games that have these loot boxes, thinking about a solution where we kind of remove them, but then it does lead us then to the other way of, well, how do companies then kind of go around this, because they will attempt to. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm, so, but think about then sort of what is a loot box then? Obviously, like again, going back, then think about maybe thinking about card packs, for example. That's also one of these kind of classic examples nowadays. For example, with FIFA,
Yeah.
the Ultimate Team, that was directly cited, I think, in the Belgium Act of where they attempted to ban those, or what they did ban them, right? But then how does that sort of, maybe it's not as effective as you've also kind of shown that as well, that these things, even though you ban them, they might still be, enforcement is then obviously another thing in general. But card packs. So, do you think there are kind of are card packs also just loot boxes? Is kind of my question.
Well, when implemented inside the video game, so say in like Hearthstone, or Magic the Gathering Online, I would say yes. Certainly the regulations that have now been implemented against loot boxes in different countries would apply to the car packs. But at the same time, we very recently did this study looking at both car packs, the physical one in the real world normal loot boxes, and also specifically the loot boxes inside card games. So like in Hearthstone and in Magic the Gathering Online. And we actually found very different results. So for the physical card packs, now for a bit of background, there's been this very consistent line of research supporting, shall we say, more regulation of loot boxes, because psychologically, it has been found that spending money on loot boxes is linked to experiencing harm from gambling. So people are concerned perhaps that a potentially vulnerable group of consumers are spending more money than others on loot boxes. So that's where the concern comes from. When we tried to re-examine this relationship amongst all three different types of products, what we found is that for the most generic type of loot boxes, the strength of the relationship between spending and problem gambling was the strongest. So that seems to be the most concerning type of product. But then when we looked at the card pack type of loot boxes inside video games, the strength of the relationship was weaker. Now, this be might support the suggestion that that kind of loot box is less harmful than the average loot box. Whilst also, I think, more interestingly, this also suggests that different types of loot box implementations in different genres of video games, or even in the same genre of video games, but just literally in different video games because of how they're designed, are related to problem gambling in a different way. And depending on the strength of that relationship, this product may be viewed as more concerning or less concerning. So because the car pack type of loot box is weaker than average, there must be some other type of loot box that is stronger than
Mm.
average to balance that out.
Yeah.
Um, we don't know where that might be. That might be perhaps the so-called social casino games, where
Mm.
you can spend real world money to buy virtual currency, casino chips, to bet on traditional gambling activities such as blackjack, slot machines, poker. But the important thing there is you cannot convert any winnings back into real world money, which makes it not regulable as gambling, but instead is this sort of simulated thing. Perhaps that is the most harmful. There are some research studies that would support that. But then we look at the physical car packs. Now, those are the products that have been available for many decades, where someone would open it physically, tear it open, and then get random cars. For that, the relationship between spending on that product and problem gambling was the weakest. In fact, if one is to apply some of the ways of interpreting the strength of a correlation, that might be viewed as a very weak correlation.
Mm.
Some might even say it's a negligible correlation. But yeah, so these products, although conceptually they might be similar, they might be regulated in the same way because of how products are defined in the legislation. They do seem to be different when we look a bit deeper into their psychological underpinnings.
Yeah. That's absolutely fascinating. I think that instantly what comes to my mind and what I've been also sort of looking up on in my research is obviously accessibility, right? We're talking
Mm,
about with these digital products, we're talking about accessibility levels of like instant
yeah,
gratification things like this, where you can buy ten like dozens of these packs and loot boxes in mere minutes. So do you
yeah.
think that has kind of maybe that is a potential reason? This is obviously going just beyond loot boxes as well talking about regular gambling with via like phone apps nowadays.
Yeah, when they're available on your mobile phone rather than when you have to literally go somewhere else, maybe you have to take a bus before you can get to the place where you gamble. Yeah, the easier it is to access. Yeah, I can see certainly why that might potentially be more harmful. That has been suggested in relation to car packs, the physical ones, as compared to loot boxes, because as you said, for the loot boxes, it's very easy to open loads of them very quickly just by clicking your mouse or tapping on your screen. But with the car packs, you actually have to go and physically open them. And it takes a while for you to open those packs, look through all the cars and sort them. But with that said, more recently, Magic the Gathering has been releasing these very, very expensive booster packs. So um, it has now become possible to spend a lot of money very quickly. Now
Yes.
you're opening one pack, but that pack, I believe it costs uh, upwards of 100 euros now. Some of the collector edition packs and whatever they call them, but much more than what a usual pack used to cost.
Yes. I mean, when you have, for example, you took that example of Lord of the Rings, the Magic the Gathering and
Mm.
the Lord of the Rings, the recent Lord
Yes.
of the Rings edition of that, the set. I mean, when you have in a pack cards that are currently going for hundreds, thousands of euros. There was this big one that everyone was sort of searching for the
Yes.
one ring that was then
Yes.
bought for enormous amounts of money. When you have kind of these cards, when you have them in something that is completely just random and you buy it, at it's a question of what separates it at that point from a scratch ticket.
Scratch ticket or even a lottery, right?
Yeah, right.
I believe
Something,
that
a
that car.
gambling product. I mean,
Yeah, that car you're talking about, I think Post Malone, of
yes.
all people, bought it for, I don't know, 500,000 or something like that. And
Something
each
like that.
pack would have costed like $100. Well, that was my understanding of the issue. So it's almost like literally, buying a ticket into the lottery. Um,
Mm,
and
yes.
I have read posts on Reddit of people saying that they have done that.
Yeah. So,
So
sort of discussing this further, I mean, it's there is a difference, obviously. Sort of being the kind of devil's advocate of, I mean, there is a difference if one wouldn't buy it. If with a gambling product, it's the money that you get sort of from that lottery, from that scratch ticket, is obviously provided by the company, kind of no questions asked. If you win, you win. But in
Yeah.
this kind of with these card packs, there is the secondary market is the
Yes.
one who then kind of determines that value, right? So.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, kind of going forward, is that with these kind of uh, in video games with loot box systems, do you think the secondary marketplace that, for example, Steam has, for example, the FIFA, I think still have those kind of player marketplaces where you can get in-game, you can sell the players that you don't want, yada yada. But do
Yeah.
you think they have sort of a role to play in this all of this kind of thing? What's the sort of
Yeah, I mean, the gambling laws of most countries would say that if there is a secondary market, if the items that you obtain from the randomized product is, transferable between different players, that you can sell it for real world money. I mean, even though the process might be quite convoluted, as long as
mm,
you convert the item into money, that product will be illegal gambling.
mm,
Uh, the thing is that this point has actually been tested by psychology research that David Zendel has led on. They specifically tested whether the loot boxes that allows players to cash out, in other words, to convert the prizes into real world money, are more harmful, let's say, than the usual loot box. And I believe the result was that it was barely more
mm,
harmful.
mm, mm,
In a way that is negligible. Basically, they are the
mm,
same. It's not obviously more harmful. And
right.
this is actually, this remains something that has to be tested. But
Yeah.
one of my hypotheses has been that perhaps it is the secondary market that makes people more rational about the purchases
Mm.
because uh,
Sorry, irrational or rational?
rational.
Right.
Because you see, people don't like the gambling law doesn't like the secondary market. They view the products with a secondary market as worse. But
Mm,
I'm not sure that is necessarily correct
mm.
because with the secondary market, it makes all of the potential prizes directly purchasable. So
Yes.
someone can choose to not engage with,
Yes.
say, the car packs or the loot boxes and just directly buy what they want to buy. Now, they might be spending quite a lot of money trying to get that thing, but
Mm-hmm.
no chances involved. So the engagement with loot boxes or car packs becomes optional, and you know exactly how much you will be paying. And I think also just because of the way, and certainly, I personally have played Magic the Gathering, and
Mm.
I do remember looking up the prices of cards and thinking back, oh, well,
Right.
this pack costs, I think 3 or 4 euros converted thereabouts. But if I open it on average, the cards that I will get would be worth 1 euro. So
Yeah.
why would I be opening the packs? It's just not a good idea for me. So perhaps there are some players, at least, who make more rational decisions
Yeah.
with card packs and loot boxes when there is a secondary market.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for everyone. I think there are still people who would certainly open the loot box or the card pack, knowing that they are on average more likely to lose money. But
Yeah.
some people perhaps
Mm.
would be more rational because of it.
I I can definitely see that sort of the idea. On one side, you have that exact say that the what you mentioned, where you can bypass the gambling aspects of it, right? So you don't have to engage in that. You can buy the product directly from other players. But then on the other hand, maybe you have then players who are actively purchasing those kind of packs and those kind of
Yes.
boxes in an attempt to get actually something valuable, like we
Yeah.
saw with the card packs, for example, trying
Yeah.
to catch that sort of to then later on sell. So that the connection it is definitely one of those that I don't still think still has been sort of fully
Yeah.
answered yet
Yeah.
of this. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, and of course the law would just regulate the product in the same way for everybody, right?
Mm.
It's not capable of differentiating between people for whom this product might actually be better and pro people for whom this product is worse. But yeah, Very interesting. Now that we are thinking a bit
Mm,
more about the way these things are regulated.
yeah. Yeah, well, I did take the example of Steam, right? But I've been thinking about this a lot with Steam, for example. Also, kind of scrolling through Reddit now and again, and whenever kind of Steam is up, people are quite ready to kind of defend Steam on a lot of fronts. Steam has done a lot for the sort of gaming community, like kind of. Like for example, now with their family share system that they just now kind of brought up, where people can actually play the games between the family that they have. Sort of you have that one copy that you can share kind of quite freely. But then there are some people that say that, oh, but Steam promote like allows gambling essentially. But thinking about this, isn't then Steam, if the kind of argument is that these are gambling, especially these that you purchase, you can then pass on, you can actually get kind of money out in various ways. I mean, Steam sells hardware, so you can just kind of buy that and sell that if you want to, but obviously Steam does not allow direct cash out, right? That's kind of a no-go for Steam. But then is Steam an unregulated gambling market?
And we very recently published a paper saying yes. The thing is, at the end of the day, what is possible through Steam is you can spend euros, let's say, buy a key, buy a loot box, open it up, get a random reward, sell that random reward for money in the Steam platform. If you do that enough times, you can have enough Steam money that you can, as you say, buy, say, the Steam VR headset or the Steam Deck by spending money in your Steam account that you gained by selling what you won from loot boxes. And then that physical product will be delivered to you. And of course, you can sell it on eBay for real world
Yeah.
money. So yes, it's a bit convoluted, but eventually you can go from one to the other. The thing is, we get stuck thinking about this, but if, say, there was a casino where they say that you can spend real world money to gamble at our casino, but we will only give you, let's say, uh, candy. Uh, and
Mm,
but then you know full well that there is a way to sell the candies for
mm,
real world money somewhere. Then
I've
of course the gambling regulator or the police would be jumping right on it, being this is illegal gambling. But it wouldn't work in a physical world. We wouldn't let that go. Um, but why are we letting it go in the
mm,
virtual world? And of course, with what you say about, yeah, the Steam certainly has, done, good things, but a company can do good things and
yeah,
bad things at the same time. That's it's not black and white, these things.
yeah. That kind of gets me to the question then of, well, okay, there are these kind of, not besides just purchasing uh purchasing hardware from Steam, you can there are the tons of these and tons of these skins gambling sites and these kinds of third-party sites that Steam then allows you to sign in to with your Steam account. Their API basically allows this kind of system as well to operate. But is kind of a question then, what is there sort of to do? How can this be regulated? I mean, you know as well, here in Finland, the police basically said, the police board that sort of surveys the gambling operations in Finland said that we can't do anything with this.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the Finnish example is a pretty funny one. I Yeah, let's go with the Finnish example first. So yeah, in Finland, the police said, well, it satisfied all the definitions. But the problem was with the way the Finnish criminal law works, because the crime that is attached to operating this sort of illegal activity, I believe the term of imprisonment, the maximum term, is not enough to allow
Mm,
jurisdiction.
mm,
So basically, it's not a severe enough crime for it to be punishable against foreign companies. If it was a worse crime, then it would have been possible. But that's just a flaw in the way the Finnish
mm,
criminal law has been designed. I think that problem can be easily solved by the legislator just going and changing what the maximum term of imprisonment for committing that crime would be, or just changing it so that, it's actually suitable for the 21st century when a lot of crimes are committed over the internet and not from within Finland.
Mm.
Um, that example was quite ridiculous. I don't know if you've seen the opinion from the prosecutor, but it's literally, yeah, this is wrong, but we can't do anything.
Yes.
Um, I'm
Something
not
like yes, along the lines of that, exactly.
along the
Yes.
line. And I was also quite, with the Finnish example, I was quite unhappy with how at least I felt like,
Mm.
certainly outside of Finland, that
Mm.
report hasn't really been reported on by journalists. Because
Mm.
if something like that, I think, say it happened in the UK,
Mm.
there would be quite a bit of public outcry and demanding for the law to be
Yeah.
changed. Because
Yeah.
that sort of thing can't stand. Is
Yeah.
yes, no, they're doing a bad thing, and not because we don't have enough, manpower, resources to go after them, but literally because our criminal law, our criminal justice system is not good enough.
Mm.
I'm not convinced, right? And
Yes.
you
It's
finally,
kind of it's this thing that it's sometimes cited in this, right? Of these, we
yeah,
now and then get these news articles about, Counter-Strike, Steam, loot boxes, and Supercell also. Now that they kind of move away from loot boxes, but yeah, it's something that's sometimes cited, but kind of it never was then followed up on.
yeah,
The bill, the proposal to amend the gambling law is now obviously, not obviously, but
yeah.
also that got basically not repealed, but because the government changed, then that bill also just got dropped. It didn't get sort of enough to
And
go into the system of bureaucracy where it could have been, discussed further, but that now it just needs to be brought up again, but that's not happening. We also have the other gambling law kind of
yeah,
whole renewal of the gambling law,
yeah,
moving away from the monopoly to the licensing. So that's taking time, and it's not looking good. Yeah, at the
no,
moment.
no. And the thing, because you mentioned all of these things, three things now I want to talk about. First one is that bill that Sebastian Tokanen uh
Yes.
proposed. That bill wouldn't have done anything even if it passed because of the same reason
Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
uh the Counter-Strike example didn't work. The law would have worked against Supercell and any other Finnish company, but for any foreign company,
Yes.
even if the law was changed, it wouldn't have done anything.
Yes.
Uh, and that I think again reflects on how people didn't really understood that the reason for the inaction against Counter-Strike was not because the law was not in place, but it was because the criminal justice system had a bit of a bug, as I would
Yes.
describe. The thing with Supercell is, yes, they sort of um, did that whole thing with, well, we're removing loot boxes from Brawl Stars, but
Mm.
they've since brought them back, and they've actually done a talk at GDC this year,
Oh,
saying that it was a terrible thing in hindsight because
to move away from them.
yes, because these things engage people, and
Yes.
of
Wow,
course,
no
a lot of
wonder.
money. No wonder. And now it's all back. You can buy them again, and even
Wow.
post. And of course, with the newest game they've done, Squat Busters, it's a
Yes.
very prominent thing, the loot boxes. And I've been having a bit of uh, shall we say, a long-standing argument with Supercell because they're
Mm.
not disclosing probabilities for the
Yeah.
loot boxes in Squat Busters, which is very bad, and certainly against European Union consumer law. Uh,
Sorry, you mean they're not?
they
They're
are
not.
not. So
Ah,
for the Clash Royale game
yeah.
and for Brawl Stars, they
Yeah.
did disclose
Yes.
probabilities.
Yes.
So at least they've done that. But for the new Squad Busters game, they haven't disclosed probabilities. I've been
Mm.
chasing the head of their comms and PR. She hasn't got back to me.
Yeah.
Um, and also in the UK, they are not disclosing the presence of loot boxes inside those video games when they're advertising those video games, which
Mm.
is required under
Yes.
advertising regulations. I've quite recently been in London and I walked past this very big billboard where they're advertising Brawl Stars with the new SpongeBob
Mm.
collaboration. No disclosure. That's
Yeah.
illegal.
Yeah. That the disclosure that you're talking about is the sort of the requirement to say the state that this game has these kind of loot boxes, or yes.
Yes, just
Yes.
merely to say that the game
Yes.
has even that requirement,
Yes.
that was not complying with. I've seen some of their newer advertising that now has a very small sentence. So you'll be looking at, let's say, maybe I can send you some screenshots after we're finished. You can put onto the screen. But basically, the text is so small that you will not be able to see it unless you know exactly what you're looking for and you zoom in because the text is so small compared to the play now buttons and whatnot. But
Right.
going back to what we were saying earlier about Steam with the API, I
Mm,
think what Steam can do is so at the moment the API can be used by anyone, and that's
mm,
how it
mm.
works. I think it is possible to instead create a whitelist system where only approved services can gain access to the API.
I
Um,
Yeah, I don't see a reason why that wouldn't be possible. No, there's just no yes. I
there's no
mean,
will to do it, but it's
no,
possible.
no, 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 of course not.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, yes,
And if we
it's
want to better regulate, I think that would be
mm-hmm,
the way to go.
mm-hmm. Being kind of a not a cynic, but just thinking about it in terms of I mean capitalism essentially, then why, if there is kind of no will to regulate and no possibility to enforce really, and no kind of will to do that either, the enforcement, or no manpower to do it, then why would we kind of go and do the effort of actually doing changing the API, banning these kind of schemes, gambling sites, if that actually kind of feeds our system, right? Of where, I mean, that sort of, yeah, not saying Steam does that, but obviously not saying that Steam actually kind of in no way promotes this kind of system, but they have no currently, I mean, yes, they don't have a reason to do this, to actually go in and sort of um once in a while. I mean, it's not that they haven't done this, right? To go after these sites that abuse the API, the kind of do these illegal things. They have I think the wave was already back in like 2015. Maybe there's recent waves of where they go after these skins gambling sites, but still, it's like as I kind of mentioned that regulation wise of where the possibility to kind of regulate is quite difficult. But do you see a possibility, for example, like should the EU maybe, or EU now, we're using example of Finland as well, we talked about, but within the EU, should there be kind of a movement regarding this of kind of unilateral stance, or should it be left to the individual countries on this kind of these, yeah,
Well, I mean, the thing is, of course, for traditional gambling, the countries within the
yes,
single market, they do differ as to how they regulate gambling. So I don't think it will be unreasonable to say the loot boxes should also, well, or at least can be allowed to be regulated by different countries in different ways. But the thing is, we are now, because quite a few countries have now done something about loot boxes, but what they have done is all different.
mm,
So, Korea has done something, Australia's done something, the UK's done something, China's done something. This is actually making it really difficult for the companies to
mm,
comply.
mm,
Now, these are all legal requirements, so they must
yes,
comply. But then, they have to be very careful to know what the rules are in all of these different countries. And, you say EA, they can comply. Supercell, I would expect them to be able to comply, to know what the rules are in all of the countries where they operate. At least they should.
mm,
Uh, but for, a smaller indie developer, I don't necessarily think that's a reasonable ask.
mm,
Uh, what maybe it is reasonable. You should know exactly what the law is in every country that you operate in.
right,
But practically, though, I don't think that's really possible. And I think a lot of the time they're just relying on reading like a news report, and trying to comply when they get it. Because, I had the experience where after I conducted my study in Belgium, they found that quite a lot of games were still selling loot boxes, even though the mechanic is banned. We had a few companies that complied with the ban after my report, which came out 4 years after the original decision from the regulator that said, please do not implement these mechanics. So the companies are literally relying on news reports
right,
to know what the law is in different countries. And of course, coming back to your question, the more different regulations that we have in different EU countries,
Mm,
the harder it is for companies to deal with it. But the problem now is, in the EU, the European Commission has said that the existing consumer law that is available in the EU, and that is, I would say, fair to say, world leading in terms of
mm,
providing protection for consumers. It can always be better, but it is better than most places around the world. That could be applied in relation to loot boxes, or rather, it does apply to loot boxes because, of course, that's a commercial product. So, of course, it applies. And the European Commission has actually specifically said two things are required, both of which we mentioned earlier. So,
yeah,
disclosing what the probabilities are for getting different items, and also disclosing that the video game contains loot boxes. But even though that has been what the law is basically across the EU, we haven't seen enforcement. So
yeah,
it's not necessarily the regulation isn't there, it's enforcement. And so even
yeah.
if we do change the law now to be something else, again, I'm not convinced that it would
Mm,
actually be
mm.
enforced. Then it doesn't help anybody.
There is definitely no easy easy kind of answer here. But what you did mention that is also interesting, the other point that it doesn't really this whole thing having tens of these kind of different regulations that you have to follow instead of kind of a unilateral one of, for example, if we would have EU-wide kind of this thing, it's a bit different from traditional gambling because the mechanics are different, because the kind of implementation is different. And then there's the issues of kind of spending money versus currency, all these kinds of things that make it more difficult. But then, yes, exactly. It's not easy for small companies that would want to do it, especially, I mean, if they would well, loot boxes. It's kind of this leads me to my next question is then that do you think like being I would consider myself kind of a gamer. I've like I really love games. I've played games 20 years now, and it's this kind of like I've never been really into loot boxes in any single game. I played Magic the Gathering Arena, I played Hearthstone, but do you think, I'm not sure if you're kind of in that sort of gaming sphere, that much gaming space, but do you think these kind of loot boxes are then like here to stay? Is there this kind of idea of is it kind of a Pandora's box at this point of like these mechanics are so kind of engaging, so productive for the company, so kind of that they're, even though some regulation might be them, put the enforcement is so hard, so difficult, so gaming companies kind of continue to do this, but is there a way sort of to go back to do not have loot boxes in the game, especially in games with minors playing them, you know?
Well, I mean, um, I think maybe this comes down to where the games are made. At least most of the
Mm,
popular games are made. I think we're looking at American games and now increasingly Chinese games.
mm,
I don't think either of those two jurisdictions would place a restriction on loot boxes in the next couple of years. China, I don't think would. Uh, China might say, hypothetically, that they would not be permitted for under 18s. I think
yeah,
that might happen. That's something, if you say that happens in the next 5 years, I was like, yeah, it's possible. But I don't think they would touch the adult market. In the US,
yeah,
nothing will. So when those two countries are not regulating the mechanic, I think they will continue to be available in the most popular games that are
yeah,
played.
yeah,
And back to the point where you were saying that you haven't really engaged with loot boxes. I play plenty of games myself, including games with loot boxes in them,
mm,
but I haven't engaged with them. Um, but I guess that's what kind of the problem is, right? Because when there are so many players of these games, some of them free
mm,
to play games, that are playing it for free, there
yeah,
must be a few people, the so-called whales, who are spending
mm,
ridiculous sums of
mm,
money to
mm,
support the game and everybody else. Um, yeah, it's yeah.
yeah. Mm, then it's not as if banning loot boxes, this kind of removing them completely, is I don't think a good idea. It can't be done, I think, and it's not a good idea. It's never. I don't think I'm that kind of a person where kind of prohibition and this kind of thing. It rarely works in a sense that There's, you then you go to the black market, and you have all these kind of things. But I do think there is value, for example, with trying to protect kids from this, protect minors from these mechanics, from these kind of, because they can be extremely addictive. There's problems with them. The kind of there's all sorts of issues with it offering these kind of mechanics to kids.
Well, I mean, in the UK, what they're saying now is that the industry will implement measures to ensure that anyone who is under 18 would not be able to purchase a loot box
Mm,
unless they have explicit parental consent.
mm,
Um, I've tried the highest grossing games in the UK. We're doing kind of this mystery shopper thing where we are pretending to be 17 years old and we're going into these games. Whenever they ask us, how old are you? We say we're 17.
mm,
Or we enter a birthday that would mean we're 17 to try to see whether they will sell us loot boxes. Yeah, they always just sell us loot boxes,
mm,
no questions asked. You have a few games who might be like, oh, you're not 18, so we can't let you play the game. But if you
mm,
come back in 2 hours and tell us your birthday again, we'll let you play. And or it has one of those buttons that
mm,
says, are you over 18 or not? And the yes button is super big in green, whilst the no, I'm not, it's like super small and grayed out. Like the thing is, I don't think really we have effective age verification yet.
mm,
So it's very hard to say and be confident that you can protect children
mm,
without
mm,
also
mm.
at the same time affecting the adults,
Yeah,
right? If you apply a ban for everybody,
yeah.
um, yeah,
That then brings us to the point very well of there is a need, still an ongoing need for educating parents on these mechanics. Watch what your kids play. And I have a now 5-year-old daughter myself, and obviously I play together with her, and she doesn't play anything I'm not aware of.
yeah.
Yes, so being aware of what actually your kids are playing or spending their money on is just extremely important, right? Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I guess from, if you speak with people from, say, public health and gambling research, they might say that this is a sort of like individual responsibility narrative of the issue. Like this is a problem that the companies have created,
Hmm.
but we are asking individuals to protect themselves rather
Mm,
than to do
mm,
something about the problem.
yes,
Um,
yes.
yeah, so people object to that particular narrative, but I think as a pragmatic thing, given the lack of regulation, and everything, I think that you are right. That is what we need to do. But then, of course, what I'm concerned about is not you, for example. Like I'm sure your daughter would be perfectly
Yeah,
fine.
yeah,
You
yeah.
will look
Mm,
after what she's playing. So I'm not concerned there. What I am concerned are the young people who do not necessarily have someone who will be looking over their
yeah,
shoulders.
yeah, yeah,
What can we do about them? I
yeah,
think that probably is the more difficult question here.
yeah. I definitely agree there. Yeah. Um, this kind of gets me to the point of then, because one of these huge kind of markets where we've seen kind of these at least attempts to enforce, to regulate, to kind of control gaming, get just gaming, is China. In the, I think 2000, maybe 2019 to
Yep.
2021, it's kind of hard at times to get kind of accurate information of what exactly is going on there, but they did kind of set
Yep.
these limits for
Yep.
underage players of maybe 2 hours weekly or 3 hours weekly, and then weekends is different, but kind of strict limits of
Yep.
how much kids can play and how much they can spend on those
Yeah.
games.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, luckily, I can read Chinese, so I do like this is another problem with different countries coming up with
Mm,
different regulations is often they just publish it in their own language, which is that's acceptable, I guess. But maybe in this globalized world and for this very globalized industry, you do
mm,
actually have to provide an official English translation
yes.
because otherwise people won't. be able to know what the law is. But yeah, so in 2019, it was an hour and a half per day. But on public holidays, it was 3 hours. So
Yeah.
that was still, quite a bit of time in 2019. But then in 2021, they changed it to 1 hour, and specifically from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and public holidays only. Um,
Okay, so now it's only the sort of only the limit is
yes.
only on holidays and weekends. So
Yeah, so you are only permitted to play for 1 hour on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays between 8 to 9. So it's
right. So
literally only
no
three
playing
hours.
on weekdays at all.
Nope.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, so it's only 3 weeks, not 3 weeks, 3 hours a week. As
Yeah.
compared to previously, it was 1.5 hour per day. So
Yes.
that means 10.5 hours per week. This has led to basically a lot of the Chinese games, I think, have abandoned the underage market because it's no longer possible.
Yeah.
A lot of
I mean, imagine so because yeah, I mean that's not a lot. Think about like 3 hours a week, essentially. It's not a lot of
Yeah, but like,
game.
Genshin Impact is a very popular game,
Yeah.
made in China, that's updated regularly with new story. If you only play it for 3 hours a week, I don't think you'll be able to finish the story,
Yeah.
let alone do anything else.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've done one study where we used Unity's data to look at whether or not the rate of people playing heavily in China has reduced. Um, the results said no, we couldn't see a reduction in the amount of heavy play. But then, that sample had quite a major limitation, which is we didn't actually have the age of the players, so that was a sample of both adults and
Yeah.
children.
Yeah.
So it could literally have been that
Yeah.
there were just so many adults playing that we couldn't see the
Yeah.
effect on children. It could
Yeah.
also be that children have just used their parents' ID and then became
Yes.
an adult.
Yes.
Uh, and then again, we wouldn't be able to see it. So
Yes.
yes, also, so the policy is also really hard to measure whether or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. I think this is something that like it's interesting, but I think that's yeah, it's interesting, but these are things that maybe can be then seen down the line somewhere. 5 years from now, maybe looking at gaming
Perhaps.
disorder rates
Yeah.
from China, maybe they're significantly lower, maybe there's other problem. Yeah, these are things that I don't think can be quite yet understood, definitely.
No.
There are also, I think, at least they had plans. This, I think, has also changed a bit, but they had the plans
Yes.
to kind of categorically remove, abandon the loot box and daily logins and things like this from minors in the games. But maybe this is has changed. There was a quite a drastic loss of stock value, from example, from Tencent and
Yes.
other Chinese companies after they announced this change
Yeah.
maybe relating to that. Quite a funny coincidence, if not, but.
Yeah, it was a consultation document that they published at the end of December of last year, 2023. I think the stock market overreacted.
Mm,
It was literally a consultation. It doesn't say that this will come into force anytime soon. It was just asking for people's opinions. Um, and honestly, I don't think most of it was particularly controversial. Most of it was just literally saying what the law is again. But I think what got to people were the daily logging mechanics. So if you log in every day, you get a reward that cannot be allowed anymore. I think that was what
yeah.
got to people, because I've looked in 2024. So at the start of this year, after that draft was published, because I was curious how prevalent are these mechanics
Yeah.
in Chinese games, and pretty much every single game implemented it. So
Yes.
that would be a big change if they suddenly said that's not allowed anymore.
Yeah.
But shopping apps in China, so like Amazon equivalents, have daily logging rewards.
Really?
Yeah, you get
Mm.
like a small discount code.
Right. Yeah, I think
Or
there might be some in yeah here as well in Western, maybe using similar kind of tactics now, but maybe increasing. Yeah, but that's interesting.
yeah, or just to add to the gamification point, it's
Hmm.
often that you get a chance to spin a prize wheel to get a discount code of different value
At a shopping site.
on the shopping app. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I do believe you're right because some of the Chinese brands are coming out of China. So Shein is one of the
Yeah.
examples. Fashion brand has that implemented as
No.
part of its system.
Yeah. That's yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting yeah, but yeah, going back to the daily logins, I don't think, especially considering removing from games that are targets towards kids, minors,
Yeah,
removing them, I don't think would actually be, I think would actually be a really, a good idea, but not a bad one at all. Thinking about these kind of, they're good for the companies, obviously, they're good for engagement,
yeah,
for kind of this, but then there's a lot of things that go into,
yeah,
kind of how it triggers your things in your brain of where you
yeah.
have to kind of get this increasing need to log in, not miss out on the rewards, things like this. So yes, definitely an idea worth exploring, I would say.
Yeah, it's something worth thinking about, right? You can
Yeah.
even just test it out and see whether it's
Yes.
reduced, because I don't think we're concerned about video game play or video game spending necessarily, but what we are concerned about is overspending of time or money. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you measure those things against whether or not that daily logging has been implemented, that would be useful. But I will say two things further, I think, about the Chinese regulations. The first is that there has been research that's found that after the law came into force, the young people they're not playing video games anymore. Yeah. Uh, some are circumventing the
Mhm.
restrictions by using an adult account, or whatever. But
Yeah.
uh, more people are instead going on to the short video platform, so the TikTok equivalents, and spending time
Right.
there. So
Right.
it's not necessarily better. I'm not
Hmm.
convinced it's necessarily better. Like what activity has replaced the video game play? That's one
Yeah.
thing. The other
Yeah.
thing is, at the moment, the rule only applies until you are 18, and then after that, you're free to do whatever you
Yeah.
want. But I actually think that period just after you turn 18 is actually a high risk period.
Mm.
Because in China, that coincides with finishing high school, which finishes with a very, intense exam that
Mhm.
decides which university you go to. And usually, students would be going to university and basically having independence for the first time in their lives.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's actually a really risky period, because people would actually have time to decide what they want to do, and they can
Yeah.
choose to play video games for 6 hours a day if
Mm.
possible. There has been some suggestions that the restriction should be extended even to maybe 21 or
Mhm.
22. Um, I, I, I'm not sure whether that's a good idea or not, but I can
Yeah.
certainly see certain arguments for it.
Yeah.
Similar to gambling, in Western countries, we're concerned about young men spending a lot of money. So a measure just targeting them might well be a good policy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of interesting to observe that within China, this is kind of a possibility that they sort of can do,
Yeah,
even if they won't necessarily go through with it or, change up things, but this is something that they still can do kind of in a sense where, we talked about unilateral regulation,
yeah,
EU-wide, for
yeah,
example. It's not that different in a sense, the idea of having this kind of even playing field, even regulation regarding this. But it's very difficult to achieve. It's very kind of laborious. There are, you know, how many union members? Yeah, there are 20. How many union members are there now? But in any case, many countries, many.
it's gone, I think.
Sorry.
I think 27 of the UK
Yes,
is.
yes, that sounds about right. So, many, 27 countries, different cultures, different, completely different kind of outlooks on things, and then trying to then achieve this kind of it's difficult. I mean, what EU has done, for example, with GDPR and like you mentioned, consumer protection is really great stuff, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think the EU is capable of doing something about it. Yeah, China is when China sees something as a problem, it has the ability to just take action against it. Very
Mm,
radical.
mm,
I think the EU has taken quite radical actions. The GDPR for data protection, recently the Digital Services Act. These are all very strict regulations of technology that I think benefits the consumer, certainly. Um, but yes, it requires political will. It's certainly not in America, but I think
mm.
in the EU, perhaps maybe not as radical as China in terms of being willing to take a step, a big step, but definitely more than what some other places around the world would be able to do.
Yeah. So one final question that I had was that instead of thinking about these kind of loot boxes and thinking about this, I mean, what would you see? We kind of talked about a bit that they're, banning loot boxes. If you would ban loot boxes, there might be just something else that the company would then implement. But what would you kind of rather see, these rather than these kind of gambling like loot boxes and things like this? What would be the sort of also from the company's kind of point of view, maybe because
Yeah.
obviously it's sort of important to them kind of engagement wise, but what is the other, what is the mechanic to replace them?
I think, for me, I think I'm quite practical and maybe a bit more realistic than other researchers in terms of what could be achieved. I think we are stuck with loot boxes. I think they will remain. But what I think we could do is to have regulations that say that if you implement loot boxes, you also need to make the things that you can get from the loot box available for direct purchase at a reasonable price. Now, you
Mm,
can't sell it for like €1,000. That's not good
yeah.
enough. You gotta sell it at a reasonable price. Something like that, to make engaging with loot boxes optional. Um, that I think is something. Other ideas that have also been suggested have always been sort of because I don't think we're doing away with loot boxes. So I think better loot boxes were what we've been calling like more responsible or more ethical loot boxes. So at the moment, we have loot boxes that have thousands of different items. That leads to a probability disclosure of thousands of different items with, the probabilities being 0.000345672%. Like that sort of ridiculous information overload. That's a way for companies to sort of uh, uh, not circumvent, but
Yes,
to
yes.
fight back against the requirement to require probability disclosures. We just made the information so confusing that you can't understand it anyway. Um, to fight back against that, you can say for every loot box, you're only allowed to put in maximum 20 different items. That makes the situation easier, I think, for
Mm,
people to understand. Now, of course, this doesn't really work with a lot of games. It wouldn't work for a card game, for example.
mm.
But that this sort of thing that I think companies can do, um, and also I think perhaps companies should be checking up on the players who are spending a lot of money.
Yes. I mean, that's the thing that with gambling companies,
Yes, exactly.
duty of care is a thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. In Finland, I believe at least the state operator they called people
Yes.
to ask them about their situation when they
Yes.
were spending a lot of money, and of course, state operators are arguably a bit more responsible than the commercial companies, at least from what we can observe. But that sort of thing. Yeah, get the video game companies to check up on these players. Uh,
And it's a funny concept, only in that sort of when you first kind of hear it, but it
yeah,
does sort of make sense when you kind of more, with, for example, especially if these kind of loot box, and I do think yes, these little kind of loot box mechanics and things like are not going away, way too
yeah,
profitable for that to go away, but then have these companies actually then sort of do the responsible thing of have that same responsibility. If you're selling kind of gambling, that gambling like, then act like
Yeah.
gambling companies.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I would definitely agree there.
Yeah.
But yes, again, thanks, Leon. It was really great having this discussion with you, and talking about these things that I do think are still kind of important, even though loot boxes may have sort of entered that area where companies are kind of moving away from them, but still, it's still we have like Steam, for example, a huge proponent of this kind of economies. So I do think this kind of it's still important, it's still relevant. So yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
it's really good. I think to see more people doing research on it. Your recent paper on car packs, I really enjoy reading that.
Yeah.